You might ask the question, what is the longest repeated story in the Book of Mormon? And that would be the whole Book of Ether. It is essentially a Reader's Digest version of the Book of Mormon proper, and you can track its development across all of the other books of the Book of Mormon, because parts of those have been taken out and compiled together to make what we see as the Book of Ether. Let's look at it side by side by putting the Book of Ether on the left and passages from other parts of the Book of Mormon on the right. The narrative arcs are the same. There's a wicked environment, a small group of family and friends, they flee destruction, there's a journey into the wilderness, there's a guiding by supernatural powers, there is a building of miraculous ocean vessels, they are led to a promised land, the group splits into two factions, there are numerous wars, there are wicked kings, there are secret societies, and then utter destruction. And we can track these things against the wording of both. Now you may have to pause this video and read so you can see the comparisons, because they are just too numerous to go over in this one video. The migration narrative in Ether also matches the migration narrative for the Lehites as they leave Jerusalem and travel to the New World. There are some interjections by Moroni which match things that Moroni says in other parts of the Book of Mormon. Swords of steel are made in both civilizations. The way that prophets are dealt with in the Jaredites is the same as it is with the Nephites and the Lamanites. There is a recounting of secret combinations in both places and civilizations. There are famines in both places, and I'll show a repeated story that kind of extends this. We also have that comparison between King Noah and King Riplakesh, which I've already talked about. The ways that the two civilizations deal with materials and clothing, and just generally that they're exactly the same, despite the fact that the Ether Jaredite group should be 1,000 years less developed. The ways that wars are and contentions are dealt with are the same in the same places, as well as the pride cycle. We have the idea of prophets hiding themselves, and this occurs also in the book of Nephi and also in Mosiah. There are great battles in the final stages of both civilizations, and they mirror the same kinds of extremities and murders. And as we've talked about before, we see Ether being alone at the very end of the Jaredite civilization, and Moroni being alone at the very end of the Nephite civilization. We even have them bearing the records for others to find. There are also meta-parallels, which we'll talk about a little bit in depth next, but one of them is this idea of stones being very important, being touched by God and becoming mechanisms of translation and interpretation. This represents 10 pages of parallels, including repeated phrases, which equate to about 100 different groupings. But there are probably many more than this if we just go through each one and compare it to the rest of the Book of Mormon. And because of the Mosiah priority, some of these are dependent on what has been done in the Book of Mormon proper, but some of the passages in Ether are predictive, and we find the replacement text dependent on it. One of the things that the Ether lacks a little bit of in its historical development is its Christian ordinances, which feature heavily in the Book of Mormon proper. And I believe that that Ether is more of an indication of the Christian intervention story that was probably a part of the lost manuscript. And so it may have echoes or repeated stories that are in the lost manuscript that we don't now have access to. While we're talking about Ether and the Jaredite civilization, let's take a quick sidestep to talk about the Jaredite kings. They are mentioned right at the first chapter of Ether with a chronology of their kingdoms. The list starts with Ether and recounts his ancestry of all these kings going back to the brother of Jared. And then this king's list is related forward as their kingdoms and reigns are talked about. There are 30 kings in this line. And Ether should have been one of the kings, but he ends up being a prophet. Here's a way to visualize all the kings and their kingdoms and the fact that they go in one continuous line. Now, despite the fact that this doesn't make any sense, their history can be put into a spreadsheet, which I've done here. And one of the things you recognize pretty quickly is that there's kind of two outcomes for these kings. One is that they are righteous and they basically live to a ripe old age. Some of that they are righteous and they get put into captivity and then rescued. And some that are wicked and who are captured and put into imprisonment, and eventually somebody else, a son or a daughter, rescues them. And this goes on throughout the whole line as this history is recounted. But what makes this weird is that there's basically 2 or 3 storylines that are rinse and repeated. And the most common storyline is that a king is captured or put into captivity and then has children in their old age who then save him and then become the next king. This seems like a type scene, a template which has been reused again and again and again. Because in real life, if you put somebody into captivity, you're probably not letting them have sex. And yet, the children from those unions go on again and again to rescue their father and restore him to the kingdom so that he can pass the kingdom to this really younger child. You think that these people would get a clue and decide to kill the king instead of keeping him on in captivity and allowing him to have more children. But somehow they don't understand this pattern and they rinse and repeat this again and again and again. In this way, the storyline of the Jaredite kings goes really, really quickly. I mean, it's interjected with a few other story types and a few repeated stories that we've already talked about and some more that we will talk about. But the idea that it goes really quickly because you know exactly what's going to happen, because the king is going to be able to pass to the next generation, because even if he's captured, he will be able to sire children late in life, and those children will rescue him and put him back on the throne before giving their next generation the kingdom. And this all happens except for Ether. Ether becomes a prophet, not a king, but in his time there's this other king, which we're not quite sure about, Coriantumr, who becomes the new king who finishes off really the Jaredite civilization. It's all a bit fanciful, very unrealistic, and yet is the basis for this being a history of this very important older civilization in the Americas. In regard to evidencing the Book of Ether as a mini Book of Mormon, a Reader's Digest version, let's go over a couple of storylines in Ether that are repeated in the bigger version of the Book of Mormon. There is a repeated famine story. The first instance is in Helaman, chapter 11, and the second instance is in Ether, chapter 9. And you can see from the side-by-side that we've got the same points in the same order, same phrases, and there's a couple of similar phrases. And this continues throughout the famine story. And you can see from the side-by-side that the Ether version is slightly longer. It's got a little bit more text, suggesting that the Ether version is dependent on the Helaman version. But it's worthwhile checking my work and just seeing if you come to that same conclusion. And here is another Ether story repeated in the Book of Mormon proper. And this is Ether chapter 13. And this time I've given it a side-by-side with 2 passages. One in the Mormon abridgment, Mosiah chapter 17, and one in the replacement text, 1 Nephi chapter 3. This shows the 3 times in the Book of Mormon that a prophet has fled from a wicked king or king-like person and hid themselves, usually in the cavity of a rock, in order to evade detection. This happens with Alma in the book of Mosiah. We see it with Nephi in the book of First Nephi, and also with Ether in the book of Ether. And this side by side is really interesting because we see from Ether that it's made up of two components, or perhaps because of the Mosiah priority, it takes something from Mosiah and then lends something to First Nephi. I've also used pink in this particular example to show you where Mosiah and First Nephi align. And when I put side by side Mosiah 17 and First Nephi 3, you can see these storylines adding up really closely. So this gives that a really good indication of the interdependence between these three stories, in this case, in three parts of the Book of Mormon: the Mormon abridgment, the Moroni abridgment with Ether, and then the replacement text account of Nephi. It really shows that the person creating the three parts of the Book of Mormon is the same person, and they're drawing from the same narrative template. So both the famine story and the hiding in the cavity of a rock story are narrative templates which are being utilized repeatedly to flesh out the Book of Mormon. Now, you may be getting a little fatigued with all of these repeated stories, and there are still more, but I'll try and rush through these ones so you can kind of see some comparisons quite quickly. Now, there are a lot of these repeated stories which are in really close proximity, maybe informing the next iteration really quickly, and they're worth having a look at. Here's a small example which I've titled Gather the People, which describes King Benjamin in Mosiah chapter 1 and chapter 2, and the iteration that happens with King Limhi in Mosiah chapter 7. You can see from the side by side that they're exact wordings. I've cut a little bit from Mosiah chapter 7 verse 17 just because it goes on and it doesn't relate, just so you can see the side by side, but you can see that it's the same narrative template. And continuing on with Mosiah chapter 7, here is another example which I have titled Treaty, where Limhi talks about Zeniff and his overzealousness and how he was tricked by the Lamanite king. And then we see in Mosiah chapter 9, Zeniff relating this in the first person. This is a really good example of how a storyline might be presented in third person and then also in first person. And so you get these two flavors of the same story in a different way. And yet you can, disentangle them, or at least show them side by side and show that they're exactly the same wording. And here's more from that Mosiah 7 and Mosiah 9 comparison. And here's yet another example. We see this one, I've titled it Cast into Prison, and it is in 3 Nephi 28, then another couple of chapters later in 4th Nephi chapter 1, and then a few chapters later again in Mormon chapter 8. And these three examples talk about the disciples being cast into prison, that they're put into a furnace, that they are put into den of wild beasts. And so there's these same iterations in each example multiple times. And if you read them, they sound like exactly the same story, but when you kind of count them along with the other parts around their chapters, you realize they have to be different iterations. And the 3rd Nephi version and the 4th Nephi version are part of the Mormon abridgment, and the Mormon chapter 8 version is part of the Moroni abridgment. It's just so fascinating seeing these story templates weaving in and out of each other so that it creates new variants that don't really alert you to the fact that they are actually the same. I'm not sure that this was intentional. I think it was just the way that Joseph composed things. But the effect of it is that they feel very new and real and innovative, such that you have a different feeling about each one, so they present differently, and so you don't pick up on the idea that they're exactly the same. So I think it's absolutely clever. I'm not sure that it's genius. But I'm interested to see what you think in regard to these repeated stories and these little narrative templates and how they're being used. So your next big question probably is, do we see these kinds of repeated stories in the other works of Joseph that he is producing? And can we see some development in his text and how it is coming forth? In the same ways that we see the development in the repeated stories of the Book of Mormon and their commonalities? Well, the answer to that is, of course, yes. And it's been hiding in plain sight this whole time, and you've probably come across it many a time. And that is Doctrine and Covenant revelations, particularly from the period that he is translating the Book of Mormon in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and then also in Fayette. So you can see here Doctrine and Covenants 6 against Doctrine and Covenants 11, but it's also the case with 12 and 14. Now these revelations, Doctrine and Covenants 6 is given to Oliver Cowdery, Doctrine and Covenants 11 is given to Hiram Smith, Doctrine and Covenants 12 is given to Joseph Knight Sr., and Doctrine and Covenants 14 is given to David Whitmer. And their beginnings are all the same, exactly the same wording with the same intro, and then they're customized at the very end for each of those four men. This memorized script, I can't even highlight it because it would all just be yellow, is exactly the same in those four instances. And you can see a progression from Doctrine and Covenants 4, which is Joseph's revelation to his father. They all start out with this statement, a great and marvelous work is about to come forth unto the children of men. And although they are identical, even though the latter part is customized, none of these men seem to complain about this. And we know from revelations and documentation that Joseph is looking in his seer stone when he's receiving these particular revelations, and yet they're coming off word for word, which suggests he's actually memorized this, and this is the portion that he's going to give to everybody, and then he's going to customize to particular men with their particular needs. We see this again in Doctrine and Covenants 15 and 16, which are given to John Whitmer and Peter Whitmer Jr. And in this case, there is no customization. They are exactly the same. They're just 6 verses. And although these two brothers are two different people, they get the same charge. In fact, in verse 4 it says, "For many times you have desired of me to know that which you would be of the most worth unto you. Behold, blessed are you for this thing, and for speaking my words. And I say unto you that the thing which is of the most worth is declaring repentance." Interestingly enough, it has the same idea in verse 3, that I will tell you the thing which no man knoweth save me and thee alone. And yet, it's exactly the same for the two brothers. These early revelations are like patriarchal blessings. And, these brethren would have probably compared them and found out that there was bits that were similar or the same, just like you can do if you've gone to the same patriarch, find that he's using the same script. And none of these people ever thought that this was a problem. So just the mere idea that God was speaking to them through Joseph Smith gave them confidence that whatever he said was right, no matter the fact that it was the exact same thing that had been given to somebody else. And so these repeated stories in the Doctrine and Covenants revelations are features, not bugs. And presumably these men, as they were reading the Book of Mormon and maybe even saw some of these repeated stories in the Book of Mormon, they saw that as a feature too, not a understanding or allocation that Joseph was just repeating himself, which is a fantastic insight into the mechanism that is going on behind the scenes in the ways that these men are being convinced that Joseph is miraculously doing this. He's looking in the stone, in the hat, and he is reciting these words as he's telling them that he's seeing on the seer stone. And yet they look and feel, and you can demonstrate that they are memorized passages. And this is a really great proof too that Joseph has the capacity to do this. He has this memorization skill because he's able to produce these texts almost verbatim. I think I did a poor job in my last video, so I'm just going to go over it again because I think I can absolutely enhance what we understand about Joseph Smith and the revelations he's getting and how they relate to these repeated stories that we see in the Book of Mormon. Have a look at this side by side with Doctrine and Covenants section 4, which Joseph gave to his father in February of 1829, and Doctrine and Covenants 6, which he gave to Oliver Cowdery when he first came to Harmony in April of 1829. And you can see that the first revelation is quite short and it has some key points, and then Joseph improves this with Doctrine and Covenants section 6 using 4 as a base, and you can see those same ideas, phrases in the same order, but now he's adding a whole lot more information. And he must have memorized this because you see in Doctrine and Covenants section 6, which was to Oliver, and then Doctrine and Covenants section 11, which was to his brother Hiram in May of 1829, and you can see that now Doctrine and Covenants 6 is the basis for Doctrine and Covenants 11, and those first almost 10 verses are exactly the same, and then from 10 onwards they change and just customize to the particular person. Here's Doctrine and Covenants 12, which was to Joseph Knight Sr. in May of 1829, and Doctrine and Covenants 14, which was to David Whitmer in June of 1829. And you can see that they have exactly the same beginnings, but this time only to verse 5. So, and these 5 verses are the same for Doctrine and Covenants 6 and Doctrine and Covenants 11. And just as an aside, I've shown you there, I just highlighted the words therefore, which is in verse 5, which is repeated in these 2 verses, and then wherefore, which is in verse 10 of Doctrine and Covenants 14. Now, any of you familiar with the Mosiah Priority and Brett Metcalf's work, he showed that these words therefore and wherefore were changed during the dictation sequence, and we see that this is where it changes in that move from Harmony, Pennsylvania to Fayette, New York. Doctrine and Covenants 12 is in Harmony, Doctrine and Covenants 14 is in Fayette. And in Fayette, Joseph adopts the word wherefore rather than the word therefore. And this particular revelation shows exactly when that happens. When he's using a memorized phrase, he's using therefore, but then when he's customizing to the person, in this case David Whitmer, he uses wherefore. And this happens in the Book of Mormon, this happens in the Revelations, at this point in this transition when the location of the dictation shifts. And then you can see Doctrine and Covenants 15 against Doctrine and Covenants 16, and they're exactly the same except for the name. So in Doctrine and Covenants 15, this is to John Whitmer, and Doctrine and Covenants 16, this is to Peter Whitmer Jr. But these all seem to show that Joseph is using the same technique in his revelations that he's using in the Book of Mormon. And you especially see this in those first couple in Doctrine and Covenants 4 and Doctrine and Covenants 6, which actually were the 2 earliest revelations. So I think these really closely show that this is Joseph doing this. This is his technique. This is what's embedding in the Doctrine and Covenants with these revelations, but also in the Book of Mormon as he's working through it. It's his fingerprint. We've talked a lot about repeated stories, and I've shown a number of them from the Book of Mormon and several from the Doctrine and Covenants, and even one that combines the Doctrine and Covenants through into the Book of Mormon. These are everywhere, and they make up the narrative portions of the text. There are also a number of type scenes that repeat throughout the text, and these are more than just 2. And we've talked about ones that are 2 and 3, but there are often ones that are 4 or 5. Here's one around the idea of fleeing from a wicked king. The idea that there's a wicked king, that he does evil, that he casts out this person, that he pursues them to kill, and that the people escape. And and then they hide. And we've done this with Mosiah, and then also with Ether, and then with First Nephi, but there are others. So there's that First Nephi 3 version that we talked about, Mosiah 11 version that we talked about, there's a Mosiah 17 version that we talk about, and that Ether 13 version that we talked about. And with this particular model, I've just gone through and put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 7, and just highlighted where they are in the text. And they often follow the same order, but sometimes they jump around a bit. So the elements are there, but they're not necessarily in the same order. Here's a type scene around these ideas of all manner of, and this comes up throughout the text of the Book of Mormon. This one is particular to all manner of weapons of war, and we see this in Mosiah 9, Mosiah 10, Alma 2, Alma 43, Alma 60, Mormon 6, and I think it's also in Ether 9. And this suggests all manner of, including a list. And this goes for lots of things throughout the Book of Mormon. It's just a common trope, a common way of providing a list to a particular understanding or threat. There are lots of places through the Book of Mormon that there's the same text repeated verbatim, just kind of like what we've seen in the Doctrine and Covenants revelations. And here's one from the dreams, Lehi's dream in 600 BC and 1 Nephi 1, but also Alma reciting that same dream in chapter 36. And they're using the same phrasing, same wording, as if it's been copied. How about angelic appearances? Here we have Nephi's angel in 1 Nephi chapter 17 and Alma's angel in Mosiah chapter 27. And we see these kind of same compilations, the idea that the angel comes and speaks to them. It's the voice of thunder and it shakes the ground. And this is a common phrase that is then repeatedly used. This particular type scene is the idea of a warning, a fleeing into the wilderness by a righteous group. And this actually happens to Joseph because he's got to flee Palmyra to go to Harmony, Pennsylvania in November, December of 1827. But it happens again and again and again in the Book of Mormon. We see it in 1 Nephi chapter 2, 1 Nephi chapter 3, 2 Nephi chapter 1, 2 Nephi chapter 5, Omni 1, Mosiah chapter 18, Mosiah chapter 19, and also Ether chapter 9. And these all have common elements, like this idea that God is warning people in a dream. He's helping the righteous escape the evil, and also he brings them to a new place, which gives them not only safety, but often more camaraderie or people that will support them. I particularly like this one because this one has the idea of dragons in it, fighting like dragons for wives and children against twice as many Lamanites. And we see this type scene in 3 places, Mosiah 20 and Mosiah 43, where you see this idea of dragons. And then also it's kind of repeated again in Mormon chapter 2, where the people are fighting for their wives and their families and their freedom, and the people they're fighting against, particularly the Nephites fighting against the Lamanites are twice as numerous as the Nephites, and yet they're able to overcome them because of the righteousness they have and the way that the Lord is on their side. And just to finish off these groupings, you've got this all manner of pride of hearts, envyings, strife, malice, and again this idea of all manner of plus a list. And this happens in Helaman 13 and Mormon 8. It happens throughout the Book of Mormon with all manner of and then a different list. So it gives this idea that there are ways to say things, and an idea that keeps circulating and repeating and happens to the people again and again. And we'll talk about some more of these in the next video. I've got a few more repeated scenes that we can look at in the Book of Mormon that can give us an understanding of how they are being used again and again to make the same points in the same kinds of ways with the same kind of language. When we talked about the repeated story of Korihor and Sherem, there is an earlier version, and that is Alma chapter 1 that talks about Nehor. And the bit that is common between Nehor in Alma chapter 1 and Korihor in Alma chapter 30 is this understanding that you're not punished for your belief, only for your actions. And this was a really big deal in early 19th century America, and it made its way into the Book of Mormon. And you can see from the Alma 1 passage and the Alma 30 passage that Joseph has thought about this, and the Alma 30 passage with Korihor is a lot more developed. There are 2 blotted out stories where people have left the faith and so their names are blotted out, and this is Mosiah chapter 26 and also Moroni chapter 6. There are 2 javelin causing death stories by the same person actually, Teancum, in Alma chapter 51 and Alma chapter 62. There are 4 conspiracy to trick and bring into bondage storylines, and these are in 1 Nephi 16, Mosiah 9, Alma 30, and Helaman 16. One of the great repeated understandings is that of the reason for the small plates, and this is given multiple times in the small plates as Joseph understands more and figures out another way to reiterate this, but also maybe to deepen the cause and meaning of having the small plates. And we see this in 1 Nephi 9, 1 Nephi 19, 2 Nephi 5, and Jacob chapter 1. There's also a version in Words of Mormon and also in the preface of the 1830 Book of Mormon, which was written by Joseph. We've got 2 rising generation stories, one in Mosiah chapter 26 and one in 3 Nephi 1, where the people, or at least the rising generation, those who are young, then apostatize as they get older because they don't have the same experience as their parents. And this is one of my favorites. We have 4 accounts of vultures or dogs, of wild beasts tearing up people, especially as a form of punishment. We don't even think about this in the Book of Mormon, at least, not until you kind of extract it out. But there's one in Mosiah chapter 12, Alma chapter 2, Alma chapter 16, and Helaman chapter 7. There's also ways that Joseph is able to use the same story over and over again. For instance, Lehi's dream in 1 Nephi, Joseph relates, and then Nephi has his own vision, which then he records, and then the brothers question him about it, and so he reiterates it again. So the 3 times this particular vision of the tree of life and the dirty water and the great and spacious building is recounted in the small text of the Book of Mormon. And considering how many times in the text it basically says there's not enough room on the plates, or this is only 100th of what actually happened, the idea that we even have repetition and these stories being repeated is a farce, because why don't we just only have one iteration of that story and then have all of the other iterations of other stories that are not being told because there's not enough room or because it's an abridgment and so we can't give more details. To me, it seems more likely that these are excuses for the text, not benefits or features of the text. And while Joseph has a number of storylines that he's employing throughout the Book of Mormon, and I picked that they number into the hundreds, the idea that he's using them again and again is a really interesting way to think about how the Book of Mormon is constructed and why people invest in it, even though the stories are repeats. We've talked about this a little already, but one of the enduring repeated scenes of the Book of Mormon is its ending. I told you a while back about a LDS scholar, apologist, who looked at these endings of Moroni and came up with the understanding that Moroni was borrowing his last ending, the Moroni chapter 10 ending, from Omni, where Amaleki ends the record. But let's talk about all the endings of the Book of Mormon, because the endings just keep coming up because Joseph thought of new things he needed to add. Now, the first ending for the Book of Mormon in that Mormon abridgment is in 4th Nephi at the very end, where Ammoron, being constrained by the Holy Ghost, did hide up the records which were sacred, and he did hide them up into the Lord until they might come again to the house of Israel. 4th Nephi is 300 years in one chapter, And I believe that this is a transition point for Joseph and Oliver moving from Harmony, Pennsylvania through to Fayette, New York. And Joseph needed to quickly end the record because he was going to move to New York and he's going to meet the Whitmers, and he didn't know what situation he was going to find himself in there, but he believed that he was going to be reunited with the lost manuscript, and this would finish the text, and he could just publish it. So Ammoron would be the last person who handled the plates. He is the guardian. He's hidden the record. But two problems arise. One is he gets to New York and he finds out that he can't retrieve the lost manuscript, so he has to redo that. Plus, the Whitmers, who he didn't know because they're Oliver's friends, actually really heavily believe in the work. And of course, they listen to the manuscript, which is already produced, and there are some plot holes. And one of those plot holes is, who is this recording this last iteration? Who's the narrator? And the narrator is spoken about in 3 Nephi chapter 5, and that is Mormon. So what's his story, and why is he ending this record here? And so Joseph needs to come up with the understanding and account of Mormon. So then we have the Book of Mormon written by Mormon explaining how he got the records, and then he passes it on to his son Moroni. Now Moroni ends the record of his father in Moroni chapter 8, Mormon chapter 8, verse 5. And basically he says, I'd write more, but the plates are full and I'm alone. So this is the second ending, except that Joseph needed to write more. The rest of Mormon chapter 8 is written, and then Mormon chapter 9, and then we have this ending where Moroni says, and may God the Father remember the covenants which he has made with the house of Israel. Now, why is there another ending? Well, this is because Joseph becomes aware that his uncle Jesse's been writing letters back and forth to his parents and Hiram, and they're scathing letters about how bad this must be, that they're imagining and making up the story. And so one of the things that Mormon 8 and 9 does is combat all of these criticisms about how it must be from the devil. And so these are some, responses that Joseph sees are going to be criticisms of this text. And then in response to another plot hole, probably the Whitmers who are reading this manuscript are asking about this ancient Jaredite record, which is talked about in Mosiah. Like, where is it? Because King Mosiah has translated it and he's made it available to the people, but where is it? And so then Joseph has to go, oh, well, I'm going to talk about that. So Ether chapters 1 to 4 talk about this Jaredite record, and in 4 and 5 Moroni ends this record again. And here's the third ending, or fourth ending if you're counting it from Ammoron. And he says, for you shall know that I have authority where you shall see me, and we shall meet before the God at the last day. Amen. But this brief account of the Jaredites mustn't have been sufficient, because more is written about them. And we have another Moroni ending at Ether chapter 12, after again basically saying about the weaknesses of the writing, some of these kind of excuses or concerns about how it would be perceived. And there Moroni ends it again with, I would commend you to seek this Jesus of whom the prophets and apostles have written. Amen. And so this is the fifth ending of the Book of Mormon. And I like that in this particular ending, Moroni uses the idea he's going to bid farewell, because this is going to come up a little bit later in the replacement text. But then this ending is not good enough. So we have Ether ending the record of the Jaredites, and we've shown already before in these repeated stories that Moroni's ending in Mormon chapter 8 verses 1 to 5 mirror Ether's ending of the Jaredite record in the last bit of Ether chapter 15. So now this is the sixth ending of the Book of Mormon. Now we know Joseph has to replace the lost manuscript, and the replacement text ends in Omni with Amaleki talking about the record. And this is what he says, I would that you should come unto Christ, who is the Holy One of Israel, and partake of his goodness, and as the Lord liveth, ye will be saved. And we know from those repeated stories, we can compare Amaleki to the last Moroni ending, which is in Moroni chapter 10, and those recount the same things in the same order, so they're the same story. And so now this is the 7th ending of the Book of Mormon, or if we count Malachi's ending, this is now the 8th ending of the Book of Mormon. I hope you're not getting lost. But we should also talk about the endings of the replacement text, because there are those too. Here's 2 Nephi chapter 33, and we see that I bid you everlasting farewell, and this is where Nephi ends the record. But wait, Joseph realizes that he can continue the record a little bit and give providence if he goes down the Jacob line, and so that becomes the next book, and Jacob ends the record in Jacob chapter 6 by saying, finally, I bid farewell until I shall meet you before the pleasing bar of God. But Joseph's missed something about the idea that there's an antichrist, because he put that in the beginning of Jacob, and so he utilizes the common story of Korihor and renames it Sherem, and this is Jacob chapter 7, and after that he ends the record again with Jacob in verse 27 saying, and I make an end of the writings upon these plates, and I bid farewell. So this is now the 3rd ending of the replacement text. And then Enos ends his record, so this is the 4th ending. Then Jerem is saying that the plates are small, so he's going to finish, so this is now the 5th ending. And then, of course, Malachi finishes the Omni record, and now this is the 6th ending. So if you've been paying attention, we have 7 endings of the Book of Mormon from 4th Nephi to Moroni chapter 10, and we have 6 endings in the replacement text. 13 endings altogether, and we can find commonalities between them and across these time periods, which are supposed to be distinct in the Book of Mormon. One other thing to be aware of is that as the endings go on, the endings become more personal. The text changes to second person, and so that the authors, these enders of the record, are talking to the audience, and that becomes very persuasive, particularly as they talk about how they're going to meet you at the pleasing bar of God, and so you're going to know that it's true because they're going to be able to testify it to you directly. And all of these second person endings are happening in Fayette with the text of the end of the Book of Mormon and the replacement text, which is done in the presence of the Whitmers. And it shows that the endings are very dynamic and related to the situations that are happening to Joseph personally in the moment of oration. And so they're incredibly persuasive evidence that it is Joseph who is affecting the text.